Hi, everyone. We'll get started in a couple minutes at the top of the hour. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today, Investing in Health, Local Active Transportation Financing Initiatives. My name is Michelle Lieberman. I'm the Senior Technical Assistance Manager here at the Safe Routes to School National Partnership, and I'm really excited to facilitate today's webinar that's going to cover strategies to generate funding for active transportation programs and projects at the local level. Let's go ahead and get started. A little bit about the Safe Routes to School National Partnership. If you're not familiar with us, we are a national nonprofit organization that works to advance safe walking and bicycling to and from schools, to improve the health and well-being of kids of all races, income levels, and abilities, and to foster the creation of healthy communities for everyone. We do this by working to improve the quality of life for kids, families, and communities. We advance policy change at the federal, state, regional, and local levels. We catalyze support for healthy, safe, active communities, and we share our deep expertise as we learn from the field through these webinars like today's. A little bit of housekeeping with GoToWebinar. On the left, you'll see the GoToWebinar viewer, which will see the presentation through, and on the right is the control panel. Here you can raise your hand, ask questions, and select the audio mode you'll use. Please note that the control panel will collapse automatically when not in use, and if you want to keep it open, click on the View menu and uncheck Auto Hide Control Panel. We have two options for listening to us today. You can either use your telephone or your computer mic and speakers. If you're having sound problems with one selection, go ahead and try the other one, and if you have any challenges, just send us a chat message and we'll try to field any issues. Everyone is going to be muted today, but we really want to hear your input. You can use the questions box to ask speakers questions, and we'll have Q&A at the end of the hour, and we'll try to get to your questions, as many as possible. So after viewing today's presentation, you might want to view it again or send the link to someone else. You can do this by going to our website, saferoutespartnership.org, and if you click on the Resources tab, and then click on Webinars in the list on the left side of the page, all of our past webinar recordings are stored here, so you can go ahead and review it again. So before I introduce our speakers, I want to make a quick plug for the Safe Routes to School National Conference, which will be held in Tampa, Florida in November this year. We're currently accepting proposals until February 22nd. This is a really great opportunity, and it's going to bring together hundreds of Safe Routes to School and active transportation professionals to exchange ideas and share knowledge. So we would really love to hear about the innovative work you're doing in your community. You can go to saferoutesconference.org for more information on submitting a proposal. All right, and now for our speakers. We have a great group here with us today. I'll share their bios before their presentations, but to give you a quick run through of our agenda, first we'll hear from Sarah Zimmerman from the National Partnership, who will provide an overview and set the stage. Then we'll hear from Eric Bunch with BikeWalkKC in Kansas City, Missouri, who will talk about a series of things that they undertook and policy wins that set their community up for Complete Streets funding. And then last, we'll hear from Alfonso Directo and Jessica Meany, who will talk about Measure M, a countywide transportation sales tax in Los Angeles County, California. All right, we'll start with Sarah. Sarah serves as the Program and Policy Director for the Safe Routes to School National Partnership. In this role, she supports communities in obtaining resources and advice they need to increase physical activity and safe walking and bicycling for children and adults. She oversees the work of the Program and Policy team in providing high-quality assistance and advice to low-income communities and other communities of different sizes and in different regions across the country. Take it away, Sarah.
Thank you, Michelle. Can you just confirm that my right screen is up?
It is.
Oh, excellent. Okay, well, hello, everybody. We're so pleased by the great turnout and interest in this webinar today. I am going to provide a really quick lay of the land when it comes to active transportation financing, and then pass it over to my colleagues on the call. So in today's webinar, we are going to cover these key questions. Why do we need local active transportation financing? What makes a good approach to active transportation funding? What are really those key considerations we need to think about related to that? What are some funding mechanisms or sources of revenue that we can hit really concretely for local active transportation funding? And then how does passing an active transportation financing policy occur in real life? So I'm going to briefly discuss these first three questions. And then for that fourth and very crucial question, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues on this webinar to discuss their actual experiences and really incredible successes on that front. So let's start with this first question. Why do we need local active transportation funding? So I doubt that I really need to do all that much to convince people on this call about our need for active transportation funding, but let's quickly review this. First of all, we have a really high need for some serious investment in our transportation system. The American Society of Civil Engineers has given America's roads and surface transportation system a D in their report card. This has been more or less the score that we've gotten for the last couple of decades. And our overall lack of maintenance of our transportation system means that many of our roads are in really dangerous condition. But when it comes to motor vehicles, at least we do in fact have a strong network and a sort of overall functioning system, even if it's in some disrepair. In contrast, our network for safe walking and biking is entirely absent in many communities. Even in the cities that have really the strongest biking and walking infrastructure in our entire country, what we actually have is still grossly inadequate. And of course, when we look at how what we have on the ground varies between communities, we see that our system is really deeply inequitable. Conditions are far more dangerous and less comfortable and inviting in low-income neighborhoods, neighborhoods of color, and rural neighborhoods. So overall, we've really been underfunding transportation maintenance and barely funding any active transportation work for decades. And our reliance on the gas tax for much of this funding means that we're losing ground faster than ever. So the upshot here is that to find funding to radically improve our walking and biking landscape, which is what we need, that goal is taking place within an environment where there's a serious need for funding overall for traditional transportation activities. So that gives us both a challenge, but also an opportunity as we work in this area. Now, this challenge matters because underfunding active transportation is killing us. We've seen a 35% increase in walking deaths in the last decade, as we just saw in the recently released Dangerous by Design report that Smart Growth America put out. Walking and biking overall account for about 18% of transportation fatalities, even though the percentage of trips is about half that, or just a little over half that. And of course, those deaths and injuries are occurring disproportionately in low-income communities and communities of color. And our what is really a very ugly history of urban renewal and underinvestment means that today, communities of color and low-income communities are more dependent on biking and walking, but have higher rates of injury and death due to dangerous street design. So when we look at what we should actually do about these problems, we need to really look locally. Federal funding is a crucial source of funding for transportation generally and for walking and biking specifically. But nonetheless, it provides less than 25% of transportation funding, and it appears that that percentage is really going down. Local government provides somewhere in the vicinity of 35 to 40% of overall transportation spending. So our challenge is to marshal our organizing and our studies and all the knowledge and know-how that we have to convince local decision makers and communities that active transportation is a really good investment for that local money. So with that quick overview of why all of this matters, let's move on to thinking about what are those key things that we need to think about as we contemplate advocating for active transportation financing? So I'm just going to jump in here. This is a short list. It's not comprehensive about the key considerations, but these are all important things to really bear in mind. So first of all, you really want to think about whether or not the funding level that you're going for and that you see yourself lining up for is high enough to really address significant projects. Many times in our communities, people are more than willing to throw walking and biking projects a little teeny bone. And while sometimes we're going to take that because it's better than nothing, when we look at the sort of scale of our problems and the long-term consistent investment that we need to really transform how it is to bike and walk in our communities, we need high enough funding levels that we can implement significant projects over long periods of time and count on that. So what we really want to see is high funding and long-term funding that's not just for a single project, but that we can count on. We also want to make sure that we have community engagement and community-driven processes, and that's happening starting at the point when we're starting our advocacy and starting to look at what we're going for with a policy or funding, but also extending through the passage of a policy and the implementation of it. We also want to make sure that the funding that we achieve is available for both street infrastructure projects, which are really important, but also for education and encouragement programs, because studies show us that when we see both of those together, we see the biggest shift in how many people are walking and biking. And we want to make sure that funding that we achieve is prioritized for projects in high-need areas, rather than just going to where you've got the most people advocating or the squeakiest wheels. So we want to look at data around injuries and fatalities, overall health indicators in different neighborhoods, rates of walking and biking, things like that. And then it's really also important that we think about whether or not the sources of funding or how we're implementing our funding is creating negative incentives for walking and biking. So is it discouraging the very activity we want to encourage? Or is it creating unintended consequences, particularly for low-income communities and communities of color? So we need to be thinking about that up front before we go too deep down a road that's going to have negative consequences. All right, so with that, let us jump into talking about where this money could actually come from for active transportation. We're mostly going to talk about sources of new funds, but I also do want to make sure that we think about the fact that there are some approaches that can make our local streets a lot better for walking and biking, but that don't require us to fill up a whole pot of money first. So that's things like passing complete streets policies that require that every time a new street is built or a street is rebuilt, that it's made safe and comfortable for people using all modes. There can be smaller policies like having a repaving policy that requires striping bike lanes when you repave the road. Or development impact fees, where we're making sure that as developers are building new things, that they're also putting money in or physically rebuilding sidewalks and bikeways. These approaches lack the flexibility of funds that are generated by a local government and that can be directed toward whatever purposes are identified by the community, but they are an important complement to active transportation financing approaches, and sometimes they're more politically palatable, especially as a first step. So one other thing that I just want to flag as we get into talking about different local approaches is that this can really vary from community to community in terms of what may actually be allowed. So in some states, state action is required to authorize certain types of local actions, whether that's taxation, fines, or other approaches. In some states, those are completely okay, totally good to just jump in and advocate for them at the local level. In other states, you may either need voter approval at the local level or may need state authorization to get started. So you need to look into what is actually permitted. All right, with that, let us talk a little bit about bonds. Bonds are a kind of long-term debt in which the locality receives money upfront from bond purchases and pays them back over time with interest. This is a very common way that transportation and active transportation is paid for at the local level. And interestingly, bonds are often more politically palatable because they don't require any upfront cost. But you have to pay back more interest over time, so they may be less desirable from that standpoint. And as we see, Denver, Chicago, Dallas, there's a lot of communities that are using these to fund active transportation. Now, sales taxes are another really popular way to fund transportation. We see many taxes around the country creating significant funding for safe routes to school and active transportation. This is one of those areas where some states don't allow localities to pass local sales taxes without special authorization at the state level. So that certainly can be a barrier in some states. And in 18 states, voter approval is required to pass those local sales taxes. So again, another potential hurdle. We see that 1 cent, half-cent sales taxes are very common. 1 cent sales taxes also occur some places. And these really are a popular method that occurs all over the country. Property taxes are another way of developing some funding for walking and biking at the local level. These are, I would say, overall a little bit less common, but another really solid way to raise money for walking and biking, particularly when we think about kind of the basic concept of property taxes, the idea that they're based upon the value of property and are used to provide essential services to that property. In Washington County, Oregon, and in Washington State itself, we see these being used at the local level. Now, another interesting approach that is used in some communities are traffic fines and fees. The approach that these often use are having doubled fines for speeding or moving violations in school zones. In some communities, red light cameras and speed enforcement camera revenue may go directly to fund active transportation or safe routes to school. And as you see, the pro of these approaches is that they can really generate significant funds. We see Seattle Safe Routes to School Fund getting somewhere between $5 and $13 million a year from traffic fines and fees. The cons is that traffic fines really are problematic for a variety of reasons. They're not adjusted for income generally in this country, unlike many other countries. So that means that they are overly punitive for low-income people and can really be devastating, while also not serving as much of a deterrent to upper-income people. And they can encourage over-policing and just issuing tickets instead of fixing situations that are driving people into traffic violations. So overall, we don't really recommend this approach, but we do know that they are used and are sometimes an important part of raising money for active transportation. Then ride-hailing and shared mobility fees are another interesting approach that we're really seeing emerging across the country in real time. Chicago passed in late 2017 a 15-cent surcharge per ride-hailing trip, which goes directly into the transit system, and that generated around $16 million in 2018. Now, it's important to note that because we're still just understanding what really the costs that ride-hailing is imposing upon our transportation systems, it's actually quite unclear that these fees that are being generated are even covering those costs. So while it may seem like new free money, in point of fact, there's some questions about whether we're setting those levels right, just what we really do. There's a lot of learning going on right now. We also see fees happening on bikeshare and scooters. And Portland, Santa Monica, and Minneapolis are all kind of exploring or in the midst of putting some of those fees into infrastructure. Targeted district financing is another method of generating local financing that often ends up being directed to walking and biking improvements. So that may be business improvement districts, that may be tax increment financing that tends to happen in areas that are seen as underperforming in some ways. Both of these generate funding just for that specific neighborhood or district and have the potential to be controversial, both in terms of what they're funding and the potential for gentrification or other effects, as well as the fact that they may be taking away from future tax revenue, or at least TIFs may. And then finally, I definitely want to note that donations and fundraising are another really great way to acquire a certain amount of funding. These usually create smaller amounts of funding. They may fund safe routes to school programs through grants, may fund other things like that, but sometimes can actually be quite substantial and may be a really great approach to closing a gap in funding, particularly in smaller communities. Now, there are lots and lots of other potential sources of funding, and some of those may be very feasible in certain states or communities. So I definitely want to encourage you to think creatively and really look beyond the obvious list of approaches to take. But with that, I want to just jump into turning over to hear more about how this works on the ground. So I'm looking forward to answering questions after the remainder of the presentations, and I will turn it back to you, Michelle.
Thanks, Sarah. We're going to turn it over to Eric. Eric Bunch is the co-founder and policy director of BikeWalkKC, an advocacy organization working to improve active transportation in the Kansas City metro area. He also serves as the mayor-appointed chair of Kansas City, Missouri's Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee. He and his wife live in Midtown Kansas City with their 3 kids, and they're fortunate to have their schools, jobs, and frequent public transportation within walking distance of their house. So Eric, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. I'm excited to be talking. So I would like to talk a little bit about how BikeWalkKC and our community advocates leveraged a $600 million infrastructure bond to secure funding for sidewalks. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, but bigger picture, we're going to talk about sort of the process that led us to get there and the other wins that came along with it. First, just a little bit about me and our organization. Again, my name is Eric Bunch. I'm the policy director at BikeWalkKC, and you can see our Twitter handles there, and if you would like to follow along with us on social media. And then you can see our mission is to redefine our streets as places for people to build a culture of active living. So our work is really broken up into kind of 3 categories. One is advocacy and policy, which is something that I'm going to talk a bit about here today. Congregation and community engagement. This is one that's very important to us. We do a lot of community capacity building so that other organizations and stakeholders and neighborhoods are able to advocate on their own behalf. So it's not just us doing it all the time, but this is also an important part of our coalition building to actually advocate for bigger policy issues as well. And then education and encouragement programming is something that's probably our biggest programs at BikeWalkKC, and I do want to sort of put a plug in for our programs, our education programs. We probably have one of the largest bicycle education programs in the country. It sees, we see about 5,000 students a semester through their PE classes, and ages ranging from early elementary school all the way up to high school. We do a lot of Earn a Bike programs and things of that nature. And I think it's probably worthy of another webinar about how we funded this very, very large bi-state program, but I will save that for another time. This presentation is going to go kind of fast because there's a lot to it. We're covering almost 4 years of work that we did that went into this. But generally, it may seem as though it's a mile wide and an inch deep, but I just want to provide the broader context of the events surrounding this big policy advocacy win, but to really point out that there are lots of other opportunities to win big policy wins along with some of these funding measures, but also how important it is to ensure that you have policy lined up to ensure that you have a successful funding program. So it starts back in 2015 when we had our last mayoral and city council election, and they happen every 4 years, and the whole mayor and city council are elected at the same time. And so before we got started on, before the election even happened, we started meeting directly with the candidates. So the point was to create something of a relationship with each one before they were even elected, and that way we were able to get our issues onto their radar through just providing them with our policy priority document, doing forums, and also doing questionnaires. As a 501c3, we're not allowed to actually endorse candidates, but we are able to provide their responses to these questionnaires, which is what we did. So we educated the public, but also more importantly, we put our issues on the front burner for many of these soon to be elected officials. Then in early 2016, not long after these individuals took office, thanks to those relationships, we learned that there was soon to be an infrastructure bond, and we are one of those states that requires voter approval for a lot of issues, and in this case, it came along with it would eventually come along with a slight rise in property tax. So we knew that it would go to the ballot box, but the point here is just that there are opportunities that you should latch onto in the case of without maybe having the full capacity to be proactively pursuing some of these funding mechanisms. So my advice here is to stay alert for those opportunities. Next is mobilize the community, and these are all kind of reading as though they're like a step-by-step recipe, and it's certainly not a foolproof recipe, but just some action items that I highly recommend as you pursue your own funding mechanism. So mobilizing the community, in light of that infrastructure bond, we knew that it was an opportunity to address our over $1 billion backlog in sidewalk needs here in the city, which is a pretty big hill to climb. But we knew that we knew that the bond was going to be in the neighborhood of $600 to $800 million, and so our goal was to get funding set aside. But so in order to do that, we mobilized the community through this program called Sidewalks KC. We produced a final report that actually gave a lot of policy guidance and also recommended a funding source for sidewalks, knowing that the GO bond, the general obligation bond, was coming up for a vote the next year. So this was a way to get not only recommend policy, but also engage potential advocates who could go and advocate on the behalf of the cause. So another kind of side note, or something else that was we took advantage of, was we began to update our bicycle master plan, again knowing that there is a big infrastructure bond coming up that was going to be focused. By this time, we knew that there was going to be $600 million set aside, $600 million over 20 years for streets, bridges, and sidewalks. We wanted to make sure that the bike plan was up to date so that it would actually become something that would be implemented through the use of the general obligation bond. And so we benefited from a city auditor report that of the old bike plan that basically just said it's not an implementable plan, so we need to start over. And the city council, city manager said, yeah, we're going to go ahead and update our bike plan. So that was another big win, and it was an opportunity for us to ensure that the active transportation would be on the forefront of the general obligation bond. So then pull yourself up to the table is the next recommendation. So we made sure that we were a part of every conversation that was happening with this general obligation bond, the GO bond, as I sometimes refer to it. So we lobbied to city council and the mayor's office, but also worked with city staff to make sure that as they were developing project lists, that one, we were going to ensure that there was a set aside for sidewalks. And so in this case, we asked for $300 million of the $600 million bond package to go to sidewalks. Again, a drop in the bucket compared to the $1 billion backlog. However, we knew that we had to start somewhere. And so in the end, the project set aside $150 million, so about half of what we asked for. But specifically for sidewalks, which was really a really big win. But also the other $450 million is eligible for it. Actually, we were successful in putting the words "complete streets" into the rest of the package, and the project list included what we knew would ultimately be added to the bike plan. So there are some pretty important bicycle corridors that were included in the master project list. So another way that we were able to secure some wins. So then the next one is set the expectation. And so what I mean by that is, in our case, we worked with city council to to sort of chart the course for a sidewalk policy overhaul. So back when I talked about the Sidewalks KC report, one of the primary recommendations of that was to change the historic way that we have been treating sidewalks as a maintenance issue. So we, like many cities, the city of Kansas City, Missouri, had always charged the property owner, like the adjacent homeowner, for the cost of repairing sidewalks. And so one of the findings was that, and in our old report, was that needs to change. That's really inhibiting long-term maintenance of sidewalks here, and that's really led to the sorry state of the condition of our sidewalks citywide. And so, we were really happy that the city council passed just a resolution at this point calling for the change. So I think the lesson learned here for you is that use resolutions to start to set the tone of the future policy endeavors that you might have, and also to really reaffirm the commitment to complete streets, or to safe routes to school, or to sidewalks or bike lanes, or what have you. But it also called for a complete streets ordinance, and a little bit more on that. So then change your policy, use these funding initiatives. If you have to kind of start at the beginning and make sure some of these words, that's how we were tricky with it, that we, because of the way that the bond was issued, and the ballot language was written, and the way that they adopted the project list, we knew that they were going to have to adopt some more policy. And so here we, as I said earlier, one of our key findings from our Sidewalks KC report was that we needed to remove the city needed to remove the property owner financial responsibility and take over the costs of maintenance, and that happened later that summer. So this is the GEO bond was passed by the voters overwhelmingly in April of 2017. So it's the summer of 2017. They changed the policy to say, hey, homeowners, you're no longer on the hook for the cost of maintaining your sidewalk. So another big policy win that came out of this. And secondly, another big policy change was complete streets. We didn't have a complete streets ordinance in Kansas City, Missouri. We had a livable streets resolution that had zero teeth. And so we knew that, as I said earlier in a previous slide, that we asked City Council to pass a resolution calling for a complete streets ordinance. And the way that we do those here, it's kind of unique because we have a city manager form of government, or a city council, mayor manager form of government. The resolution called for the city manager to create a complete streets ordinance, which that ended up getting passed down to the Bicycle Pedestrian Advisory Committee, which I'm the chair of. So my organization, BikeWalkKC, ended up essentially writing the policy. And so because it was mentioned in the bond, there was no definition for what a complete street was. So we made it. We created the definition and adopted it by ordinance. It's now complete streets are law in Kansas City. So another big important win to ensure that we get the most out of the GEO bond, because sidewalks is just $150 million. You need to make sure that the other $450 million really reflected the values of our organization and active transportation and safe routes to school. And then next, use the momentum for more funding. So we took the opportunity to continue pushing. And then in 2018, we had a 10-year sunset come up for our sales tax that funds capital improvements. So with the need to, and again, I said earlier that Missouri is one of those states that requires a voter referendum for all tax initiatives. It went to the vote. It went to the vote of the people. It passed overwhelmingly. And inside that, in the actual ballot language, it actually sets aside 25% of what's roughly $70 million annually at this tax raises. 25% of that was set aside for street resurfacing and also complete streets. And the idea is that street resurfacing is a great way to implement your bike plan. So because the bike plan is now almost done, it's going to help guide the practice of installing bike facilities during routine maintenance. And so this actually increases the budget for that, and it also ensures that the 100% of the $70 million is all eligible for complete streets funding and bike lanes. So it was another really big win for us that I think would not have happened if we hadn't started back in 2015 educating and getting to know our elected officials. And so then the last recommendation here is follow up. We have to continue advocating for these annual appropriations for funding because in every city the capital improvement budget is set on an annual basis. The 5-year plan changes on an annual basis, so we always have to ensure that the appropriations are made on through the budgeting process. So there still has to be a lot of work, but then there's also a lot more need to continue to advocate for better sidewalk policy in terms of how we prioritize. That still is not completely set. We're still dealing with the backlog of 311 requests on sidewalks, so some updating that needs to happen there. But we've really, I think, set ourselves up for some big successes in the future. But we are now, we will be re-electing half of our city council here this year, and also a new mayor will take office. So it will be an exciting time to continue to start this process all over again. So thank you so much. Again, my name is Eric Bunch. I'm with the organization BikeWalkKC in Kansas City, Missouri. And you can see some of my contact information there if you have any other questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. That was a really wonderful overview and amazing work that you're doing, and really great information. So I'll remind everybody, if you have questions, go ahead and enter them in the question box, and we'll have some Q&A at the end. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Alfonso and Jessica. Alfonso Directo is the policy analyst for Investing in Place. He focuses on shaping a region where all people can move seamlessly between places without driving a car. He informs his work in transportation policy by routinely navigating cities, including Los Angeles, by public transportation, reading articles and books by well-researched authors, and listening to insightful podcasts and public radio. Jessica Meany is the founder and executive director of Investing in Place. She moved to Los Angeles over 20 years ago, and for several reasons chose not to own a car. It was a choice she was privileged to make as part of her professional commitment to work to improve the Los Angeles County region to become more safe, reliable, and accessible for all, especially those with the least options. It's this passion that led her to create Investing in Place in January of 2015. And Investing in Place is a nonprofit organization that is focused on expanding the voices at the decision-making table, improving transparency on budget decisions, and using data to inform and prioritize transportation and land use investments. So I'll turn it over to Alfonso and Jessica.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Safe Routes to School, for inviting us to talk. Good morning and afternoon to everyone on the call. My name is Alfonso Directo. I'm the policy analyst here at Investing in Place.
And hello, everyone. I'm Jessica Meany from Investing in Place.
Our goal today is to go over how LA County developed an ongoing stream of funding for active transportation projects. We'll go over what motivated this policy and funding campaign, go over a few milestones along the campaign, what resulted from the coalition's efforts, and a few lessons learned from that campaign. Start off with the motivating force. The motivating force of this active transportation funding and policy campaign comprised of both state legislation and a groundswell of organized active transportation advocates. On the state legislation side, Senate Bill 375 in California was enacted in 2008 to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from passenger vehicles. And it supplements another bill, AB 32, that set goals to reduce emissions in California statewide to 1990 levels by 2020. All that to say just that this bill tasks the Metropolitan Planning Organization in Southern California, it's called Southern California Association of Governments, to develop a sustainable community strategy to meet these state GHG reduction goals. This organizing effort will start with 2012 with Southern California Association of Governments Regional Transportation Plan, and then we'll wrap up with the voter approval of Measure M, an LA County sales tax measure with no sunset that raises revenue specifically for transportation projects. It would be the fourth measure that we have here in LA County, sales tax measure. So for the purposes of this presentation, we've organized the campaign into 3 parts. First, we call it recognizing omissions in the transportation policies that are shaping the transportation systems we have inherited. Second, we'll talk about cultivating common ground with a cross-section of partners and agencies with influence by quantifying the need to shape a safer and more sustainable transportation system. And then third, we'll talk about meeting the need by using funding mechanisms, which in this story is the sales tax ballot measure called Measure M. So the first milestone that was reached in this coalition campaign was recognizing omissions. It started with SCAG, with the Southern California Association of Governments in 2012, when they were developing the Regional Transportation Plan and Sustainable Community Strategy for Southern California cities. The staff at SCAG were grappling with the bigger questions about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, while advocates were focused on the more local effects, the unsafe conditions of the streets for people who are walking and biking. At SCAG, people were asking questions like, how to incentivize walking and biking when infrastructure today is so meager and so poor quality? There's a picture of advocates over the LA River in the middle of an island. Second, they were also asking questions like how to enhance and expand walking and biking infrastructure when there was really no regional consensus over identified need for walking and biking infrastructure. Advocates were pushing answers to the questions of who these new kinds of investments should serve. Should they serve older adults? Should they serve families with children? Or should they serve both older adults, families with children, and all those in between? This second milestone in this campaign talks about cultivating common ground by quantifying the need to address these gaps. This story starts with brings in the LA County Department of Public Health, who played a key role in taking a first stab at a needs assessment. Their first stab found that their first take at this found that $40 billion of backlog was needed to improve biking in Southern California, biking and walking infrastructure in Southern California as a whole, and rough order of magnitude as well of $20 billion need just for LA County itself. So very, very large need. So with that, I'll pass it off to Jessica.
Cool. Thanks, Alfonso. And it's really exciting to be here and also to follow Eric. Our campaign here in the LA County is very similar to what I learned today about Kansas City, about the need to do policy, the need to really figure out your numbers and also stay engaged all along. Also, for some background, a lot of this work I'm really proud to share was done when I was an employee at the Safe Routes to School National Partnership. I worked there for about 5 years, and that's where I learned a lot of my tools on how to be an advocate, particularly around budgets and transportation finance. So shout out to my colleagues at the National Partnership. But what Alfonso's kind of queuing up for us is it's been an incredibly long campaign to create awareness for funding sidewalks, crosswalks, bicycle lanes, and safe routes to school and Vision Zero. And we kind of put that timeline there to give you the scope of how long it's taken and how, also keeping it real, how longer we have to go. But what I really would love people to hear is that in 2011, 2012, when I was at the Safe Routes to School National Partnership, we started organizing at our MPO level to really call out the lack of funding for sidewalks and crosswalks and bicycle lanes and safe routes to schools. And where we ran up into a huge problem is staff at that agency and other people would go, well, what's the right amount? What should we be funding? What's the need? And due to the lack of planning on these types of issues, which I'm sure happen in many communities all over, there was no cost estimates. There was no price tag. And for many of you who've been involved in budget work on transportation, the first trick to getting, the first step to getting your project built is getting in a project list. In order to get into a project list, you need an estimated cost. So what you're looking at right now is what the Safe Routes to School National Partnership, my colleague Ry Berg, when he was working with us back in 2012, we created this table. What were the costs for LA County to build safe routes to school programs in every school, to do first last mile and things like that. So this was an estimate we said of what we thought LA County needed to do. We then, as very similar to Kansas City and to probably likely what a lot of you guys are listening out there is, we worked with so many partners to continually push our policymakers to pay attention to this issue. These are some of the groups, and just to give you some scope, if you've never come to Los Angeles, our county, LA County, is home to 10 million people. We are bigger than 44 states. And the reason we do county work is, as Alfonso mentioned, we dole out transportation money primarily at the county level. Over 67 to 70% of all the money that flows into LA County that builds our freeways, our sidewalks, our roads, our trains, our buses, our bicycle lanes is happening through our County Transportation Commission. So organizing and advocating at the county level to shift money and policy is incredibly important for us here in LA. This is some of like what you're looking at now. We call this the flower kind of chart. It was the heart of our early campaigns. And really, you can see the most important thing is we were endlessly saying at every metro committee and at other city committee public meetings that calling attention to the fact that less than 1% of all transportation funding in Los Angeles County was being invested in walking and biking. Yet 39% of who dies on our roadways, a number that spikes to 48% in the city of Los Angeles, were people walking or bicycling. And then you can see the top, that 19% always blew me away. Out of all trips using National Household Travel Survey data, we realized that 19% of all trips in LA County are made walking and biking. And while we are endlessly plagued by that song, "Nobody Walks in LA," that couldn't be farther from the truth when you actually look at the data. And also, when I was working on Safe Routes to School, you can see the high number of students, 34% LA County students walking or biking to school.
Just in retrospect, to culminate this milestone, the summary, the advocates of this campaign, what they did is they adapted their arguments based off who the policies, the agencies with influence were interested in. So for places like the Metropolitan Planning Association, reducing greenhouse gas emissions was the goal. With the Department of Public Health, interests were more aligned with increasing physical activity and reducing traffic fatalities. And then on to Metro, the Los Angeles County Transportation Agency here, they were more interested in finding ways to connect people to the transit stations and stops conveniently, easily, and safely. So passing it back to Jessica to talk about meeting the need.
Okay. So here's just a little bit of our playbook. Like, so it was, is there a way to see what it says right there? Just like one of the, okay, there it is. One of the things that we knew, so when we started advocating for more money in Safe Routes to School and sidewalks and bike lanes, we were quickly told, you need to be at the table on new revenue conversations. And as you see in your slide, 2013, 2014, we started to hear chatter in Los Angeles County about a new sales tax that eventually became what we call now Measure M. So we knew it was coming, and then so we also made a play as advocates to direct Metro, our County Transportation Commission, to name what the cost was for the unfunded needs for walking and biking. So as earlier I was showing you that slide of what advocates developed as the unfunded need, our next step was to get the actual implementing agency to name that number as well. I'll do this one too.
Yeah.
So here is kind of like just a little timeline of key parts, and I was just talking about, you can see in the pink where we had the finance strategy. We made a motion for that. So just like Eric was saying, like they did, I think, did you say resolutions? We did board motions. The painful part was we pushed for that motion in 2014. We did not see our agency deliver a financial needs assessment till 2016. But you can see in pink, those are the numbers. We're talking billions of dollars. But again, keep in mind, this is a region for 10 million people. But riffing a little off what I heard Eric say, just in the city of Los Angeles alone, our sidewalks have $1 billion price tag on them right now to be fixed and maintained. So I just can't underscore the enormity of these costs. And without some research and a defendable kind of cost estimate, I think it gets really hard for at least us in LA to be at the table. So getting these needs, like these what is the price tag was critical. One other thing I want to share about our experience here in LA County is thanks to American Heart Association, who was a funder for us, and some key points is we did our own polling. So once we knew a sales tax was coming, we worked with our transportation agency to impact the survey questions to get them to ask questions like how important it is for your family and your kids to be able to walk or bike to school, or how do you feel about the quality of your sidewalks. We had no luck changing those survey questions that the agency was doing. We tried and tried and tried. And so we were super lucky. We did our own poll. We hired a professional pollster, and we just kind of worked with them to develop the questions. And what came back is we had valid statistic like samples of likely voters that prioritize sidewalks and bicycle lanes and things like that, that we were then able to put in front of our elected officials. Nothing moves an elected official more than to know what their voters care about. This slide is really just showing you how powerful that was. What you're looking at right there is the text that voters saw in the voting booth. We were able to have the word sidewalks inserted into that. So to me, I was really kind of proud, inspired, thrilled to see that when we talk about traffic, transportation in Los Angeles County, we aren't just talking about potholes and traffic flow, but we're also including sidewalks.
And so, thanks, Jessica. And so what resulted from all this effort was really a trifecta win. There was a political win, an organizing win, and ultimately a financial win for active transportation and for transportation, public transportation as a whole. Here's a political win, this Mayor Eric Garcetti, and a political coalition that was very broad and continues to work through today.
Can you go back to that
Sure.
one for a second? I just want to, this is my favorite slide, the one before that. This is our mayor of Los Angeles, the biggest city in LA County. But one of the things I love about this slide is all the strong women, and also the women are representing the Chamber of Commerce, so the business sector, American Heart Association, so public health. So how we worked with like those two was huge for us, as well as many other partners, and this was a great day for me.
And financially, what was won was money for an ongoing stream of money for sidewalks, crosswalks, safe routes to school, and first last mile access to transit and bike lanes, on the order of $4 billion over 40 years for active transportation projects, or about 6 to 8% of the measure. These were tucked into 3 different pots. These are the different pots. The biggest is in the sub-regional programs. So as Jessica mentioned, LA is so big that it's broken up into 9 sub-regions. And so those 9 sub-regions control around 3.5 billion out of that $10 billion dollars. The lessons learned, just to wrap up real quickly.
Yeah, no, we're running late. Some lessons learned, tons of lessons. These are just a few of them. One is like, it's a marathon of sprints. Is one thing I think about. But I wish our movement had done more in 2011, 2012 to be cultivating champions for social equity, so that when the ballot measure did come, we had it overlaid with the prioritization of high need communities. Our parks assessment partners were able to do that on a similar parcel tax. So if you can get it up front to prioritize high need instead of doing it on the back end, but you need political champions to do that, and so we can talk more about that. But I'm really proud of, and grateful that we were able to have our own independent poll of voters. And then I foolishly thought that a lot of our advocacy work ended on a voting day, but actually it's just begun, and you heard that from Eric a bit too. And Alfonso, I'll let you take it home.
And lastly, just a recent study came out about Measure M. I encourage you to look it up. It's if you're interested in learning more. It basically points out that Measure M voters supported the measure more for partisan reasons, and ultimately showed little interest in riding transit or supporting complementary transit policies. So it's a little sobering thought for a lot of the energy that goes behind this campaign, but it's something that really undergirds coalition politics as a theory. And so with that, just wanted to say thank you, and I'll pass it back to Michelle.
Great, thank you everyone. Let's see, let's switch back over to my screen, and we have a lot of questions coming in. And if you have questions still that you haven't entered, feel free to go ahead and enter them now. I'll start with one for Eric. Could you talk a little bit about how Kansas City is paying for the sidewalk maintenance now that there's been that change. And
they texted us directly.
Also, the backlog that you're seeing.
Yeah. So the only funding mechanism right now is the money from the general obligation bond. That's a set aside. That $150 million is over 20 years, so that only amounts to $7.5 million a year. So for context, the citywide estimated backlog is not the right word for this, but the citywide needs assessment is $1 billion. And so we're not yet at the point of actually proactively addressing sidewalk needs. We are going back to the backlog of sidewalks that have been reported through the 311 system. And that's about over the last few years. So going back a few years to address those. So those are ones that were reported through our 311 action center to the city, and then they were inspected and determined to be deficient, and then they're going back and doing that. So that's the backlog that I referenced.
Okay, great. We've got a few questions that I'll kind of group together, and maybe we'll start with Alfonso and Jessica if you want to answer, and then Eric if you want to chime in as well. When looking at kind of taking on a campaign of this size, what's sort of the people power needed, and to take this on? Is it something where you need to have people who are essentially dedicating their jobs, or is there opportunities for or strategies for communities that have less resources to take something on of this size?
Sure, Michelle, this is Jessica. I can start us off, and then Eric. Absolutely. I think like a couple of key things, like there's different parts of the campaign. In the earlier stages, I would say, of the years of just raising awareness of the need, that was regular people, that was volunteers, that was dedicated people who were like always showing up for public comment, tweeting, being there, taking pictures. Like that was a people-powered campaign, particularly in the beginning. And then it also had, for us at least in LA County, that it had a lot to do with an inside-outside game of working with agency staff and elected officials. And we also played a role of, at Investing in Place, deep dives into expenditure plans and educating. So there is that nuance of being the grassroots people-powered campaign, and that also becomes very critical in Get Out the Vote. It's one thing to get a ballot measure going, but then ensuring its success also becomes a critical decision. And ideally, like it has to be, of course, a ballot measure you as an organization support and endorse. But then what's your role in getting out the vote, and educating partners who help get out the vote? When you are part of the seeing it to the finish line, that also means you have a very big part in implementation, which is key too. I don't know if Eric, you have other thoughts or?
Yeah, I would say that we benefited from having a fairly large staff. So we have at BikeWalkKC, we have 2 full-time policy staff plus we were a staff of about 15 full-time employees. So only a few of which are doing anything in regards to advocacy and campaign building, but many people had a hand in it. That's not to say, though, that a smaller organization that may not have paid staff can't do something of this nature. We took on a lot of stuff. I mean, it was, we did a lot in the last, between 2016, really 2017 and 2018. And probably the biggest campaign we did was our Complete Streets Ordinance, and where we really got the biggest bang for our buck, I suppose, was through coalition building. So, Jessica mentioned public health and chambers of commerce. We had those involved in our coalition as well, writing letters of support to city council members. We were leveraging the relationships that other partners had with individual city council members. So they were actually going and working directly with city council on, in building support for our Complete Streets Ordinance. So I think that that's not just valuable, that's critical that you have that type of coalition behind you. And so I think that's something that really takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of energy and a lot of capacity, but I think it is something that that you can do without having such a large staff, and it is possible, but it's absolutely critical that you build that coalition.
Great, thank you for those thoughts. We're actually coming up on the top of the hour, so if you have additional questions, feel free to, I think, Eric and Jessica and Alfonso provided their contact information, and it'll be included in the follow-up email recording as well. So thank you so much to our speakers. Before we leave you today, I do want to let you know that the Safe Routes to School National Partnership offers consulting services. So if you're looking for more trainings or workshops on active transportation topics or assistance with planning or policy or program development, please email me or visit our webpage, saferoutespartnership.org/expert-help. And then lastly, we'll be sending you a quick survey to follow up on the webinar and would love to hear your feedback. So thank you again for attending. Thank you again to all of our speakers, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks.